The spark of the restless inventor. There are scenes that seem small at the moment, but that with time reveal themselves as the first turn of a gigantic wheel. And in the 1880s, in the heart of an era of smoking factories, cities growing without control, and salesmen traveling miles with a suitcase in their hands, King Camp Gillette was living precisely within one of those invisible scenes. That of an ordinary man who felt he was wasting his life selling things that left no mark, while the world seemed to be moving forward at a speed he did not yet fully understand. In those years, he worked as a traveling salesman for different companies, knocking on doors, negotiating prices, listening to excuses, always on the road, always tired, carrying that mixture of routine and frustration that slowly seeps into one's character until daily discomfort becomes a kind of inner voice, whispering that you are meant for something more, even if you do not yet know exactly what. In the middle of that context, while you are here listening to this story, probably from your bedroom, your living room, or even from work, something appears that connects different eras. That feeling of searching for direction. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from what part of the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because in the end, Gillette's story also speaks about that discomfort that almost every entrepreneur has felt at some point. That tingling sense that there has to be an idea out there waiting for you, even if it does not yet have a name or a shape. King Gillette grew up in an environment where the word inventor still sounded like a rarity, like an eccentric character who filled notebooks with impossible drawings. But in his home, there was something different. His father had worked as a blacksmith and mechanic, and the idea of improving tools, adjusting mechanisms, and turning everyday problems into practical solutions was part of the air the family breathed. From a young age, he showed an almost obsessive curiosity to understand how things worked. Taking objects apart, examining pieces, noticing details others overlooked. Although for many years, that inclination was nothing more than a personality trait without reward. Something that coexisted with the urgent need to earn money in an increasingly aggressive market. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was transforming at a brutal pace. New machines, new production methods, new companies springing up in major cities, and King Gillette, instead of being on the front line of those innovations, found himself traveling from shop to shop, selling bottle caps, utensils, products that did not belong to him, that he had not created, that he was simply tasked with placing. This distance between the analytically curious man and the mechanical, repetitive work generated a deep discomfort within him, something like a silent crisis. And it worsened when a period of economic recession caused him to lose almost everything he had, forcing him to start over from the bottom more than once. Every commercial failure, every product that did not work, every company that let him go, fed an idea in his mind that he still could not fully articulate, but that already felt emotionally clear. If he was going to dedicate his life to selling things, then those things had to be his. They had to be the result of his intelligence and not merely someone else's merchandise passing through his hands. He began filling notebooks with notes, loose ideas, scattered thoughts about everyday products people use daily, objects that could be manufactured on a massive scale and sold repeatedly, almost automatically. Until the experience of so many years watching opportunities slip away led him to a very specific conclusion. The real treasure lay in creating something people needed constantly. A small, cheap, consumable object. Something that wore out. Something that had to be replaced again and again. Gillette's mindset was not that of the romantic inventor chasing a single vision from childhood. It was more pragmatic, harsher, forged through miles traveled, indifferent customers, and financial crises. So when he began thinking about potential products, he did so with cold logic, mentally reviewing the daily habits of millions of people, asking himself which patterns repeated every morning, which gestures had become so automatic that no one questioned them, which actions were so deeply integrated into routine that becoming the provider of that small gesture could mean building an empire over time. Unlike many dreamers, he had the advantage of having observed the real consumer directly for years, with all their quirks, resistances, and habits. Between trip and trip, between nights in cheap hotels, King developed a kind of internal radar to detect objects that wore out quickly, tools that required constant maintenance, things that always needed replacing. That life as a salesman had taught him that the best businesses did not depend on a single large sale, but on a continuous stream of small purchases, discreet but constant, which when accumulated could generate enormous wealth for whoever was in the right place. Still, something was missing. The specific product, the invention that fit that relentless logic. The turning point came when he began working for a bottle cap company and had direct contact with the concept of a mass-produced disposable product. King Gillette understood the brutal power of a model in which you manufacture something cheap, distribute it at scale, and daily use itself forces the customer to return again and again. Those caps, which seemed insignificant, became a strategic lesson. Wealth was not necessarily in inventing the most complex machine, but in understanding the psychology of repetitive consumption, in aligning with the way people use, wear out, and discard things every day. That idea began to obsess him. He walked the streets, seeing the world through different eyes, imagining floating labels over every object. This is used once a day. This lasts months. This is expensive to produce. This is cheap but infrequent. He began filtering reality through that relentless entrepreneurial logic of pattern seeking until something started to stand out. Male personal care, and specifically shaving, was an uncomfortable, dangerous experience dependent on tools that required skill, time, and maintenance. Barber razors dulled, had to be sharpened carefully, represented a risk of cuts, and were often in the hands of professionals, forcing many men to visit a barbershop if they wanted a good result. At that point, Gillette's mind encountered a curious conflict. Shaving was an intimate, daily act, but the existing tools were heavy, expensive, durable, and dangerous. The complete opposite of that small, simple, disposable product model he had begun to imagine. He did not yet have the solution, only the discomfort and the intuition. But sometimes that is enough to begin a transformation. While others accepted the shaving ritual as something given, King began to see it as raw opportunity, an uncomfortable tradition that could be redesigned from the ground up. What makes this stage of his life special is not that he already had the final design in mind, but that he began to combine his experience as a salesman, his technical sensitivity inherited from his father, and his new understanding of mass consumption. That mixture of frustration, observation, and ambition became the perfect breeding ground for an idea that was still forming in the shadows, but that would soon strike his mind with painful clarity. From here on, the story will no longer be that of a tired salesman, but of a man who dares to confront something that in his time seemed technically impossible. And that is where the spark turns into a concrete plan that begins to demand its place in the world. The birth of an impossible idea. The scene that is about to change the life of King Camp Gillette takes place in 1895, on an ordinary morning that, from the outside, looks identical to so many others, with the same mirror, the same sink, and the same shaving routine that men all over the world have been repeating for generations. But inside Gillette's head, there is a noise he cannot silence. A mixture of fatigue and clarity that has been building up over years of observation and frustration, to the point where every everyday gesture begins to turn into a possible business model. That morning, he holds a traditional straight razor in his hand. Heavy, solid, heir to an entire era in which steel was a symbol of permanence and craftsmanship. And as he runs it over his face, he feels the discomfort of a tool that demands sharpening, care, and almost reverent treatment to keep it from becoming a dangerous weapon against one's own skin. Gillette, who has already lived through recessions, unstable jobs, and other people's companies in which he never quite fits, has developed a different way of looking at things. And that day, staring at the razor, he realizes that he is holding an anachronism, an object that fits poorly with the world being born around him. A world where factories produce thousands of units per minute, and where daily life begins to organize itself around objects designed to be consumed without so much ritual. In that contrast between a society that is accelerating and a tool that belongs to another era, a mental space opens up that until then no one has occupied with true radicalism. At that moment, the idea does not arrive as a romantic epiphany detached from context, but as the result of years of accumulated thinking about repetitive consumption and mass manufacturing. So what crosses his mind has a very clear structure. What if the dangerous part, the blade, could be so cheap, so thin, and so easy to produce that instead of caring for it for years, it could simply be replaced when it stopped cutting well, like someone replacing a cap or a small component of a much larger machine. Suddenly, the symbolic weight of steel, associated with durability and value, becomes an intellectual obstacle. And Gillette dares to question that dogma. The blade does not have to be eternal. What must be eternal is the habit of using it. That first mental formulation carries a kind of industrial sacrilege, because in his time, fine, sharp steel is expensive, requires complex processes and skilled hands. So the idea of manufacturing millions of small disposable blades borders on delirium. However, the economic reasoning is perfectly aligned with the new industrial era. If the blade can be made cheap enough to mass produce, the business stops being about selling a razor for life and becomes about the constant sale of replacements. The tool is no longer an almost permanent possession. It is the gateway to an ongoing commercial relationship that can last decades. Gillette has spent time working in the bottle cap industry, and there he has learned that a tiny object, apparently insignificant, can have enormous importance if it is used in massive quantities, and if it accompanies products that people consume every day. The shift in mental scale is profound. He stops thinking about large, unique machines and starts thinking about pieces repeated millions of times, about systems that only work when multiplied by numbers unimaginable to an artisanal mindset. That is why, when he imagines the disposable razor blade, he does not see it as a luxury. He sees it as a standard, something that has to be as accessible as running water. The razor he is using that morning serves as the perfect contrast, because it represents the exact opposite of what his mind is beginning to design. An instrument that demands constant maintenance, time, technique, and care. That dependence on the user's skill feels incompatible with the new industrial society, in which more and more processes are simplified so that anyone can use them without specialized training. In Gillette's head, a bold idea begins to take shape. Shaving could be a simple, safe, and almost mechanical task, if the tool were well designed and if the dangerous parts were contained within a reasonable system. The key, in his vision, is not merely changing the material or slightly modifying the traditional razor, but rethinking the entire logic of the product, separating the handle, solid and durable, from the blade, thin and extremely sharp, designed to have a limited, useful life. That conceptual separation is what opens the door to a new revenue model, because the handle can be sold at a low margin or even given away in certain market entry strategies, while the real margin is concentrated in the blades, which the user will need throughout adult life. This is where the famous razor and replacement model is born, one that many companies will later copy, but which at that moment is, above all, an act of imagination applied to a gesture as mundane as shaving in the morning. When he shares his idea with others, the initial reaction borders on condescension. Manufacturing blades so thin, so uniform, and so cheap in a material like steel seems technologically unfeasible. Metallurgical specialists of the time believe the proposal is naive, that Gillette does not understand the physical limits of the material, that he is asking for something machines cannot yet deliver. The skepticism of others does not surprise him, because he himself is aware that he is proposing an extreme challenge. But there is an important detail. He does not expect to have all the answers. What he is looking for is the right problem to devote the rest of his life to. That mental shift is essential to understanding his entrepreneurial character. Gillette stops acting like a salesman looking for products to survive and begins to behave like a visionary who has found a conflict worthy of his efforts. Something big enough and difficult enough to justify years of work, failures, and adjustments. The disposable blade is not just a potential invention, it is a life project. In his diary and private notes, he returns again and again to the same idea, refining it, trying to anticipate objections, imagining how the market would behave if such a safe, affordable, and replaceable shaving system existed. At the same time, the social context is playing in his favor, even though he does not yet fully realize it. Cities are growing, office jobs are becoming more common, personal appearance takes on a different relevance, and the notion of showing up shaved, clean, and orderly becomes a standard in many professional environments. This means that shaving stops being an occasional ritual and becomes a frequent, almost daily necessity, which reinforces the economic logic of his idea. The more the habit is repeated, the more sense a system based on blade replacement makes. Gillette imagines a future in which any man can buy a package of blades at a nearby store, place them on a simple handle, and discard them without remorse when they lose effectiveness, without the need to sharpen, without depending on a barber, and without living with the constant risk of a deep cut. That vision has something democratizing about it, because it brings into the home a task that previously required time, travel, and often extra money. As he thinks about millions of households adopting this system, he clearly sees the magnitude of the potential business, but also the responsibility of designing something that does not fail, that conveys safety, that generates trust from the very first use. That trust, however, is still far away, because the idea, however brilliant it may seem on paper, runs into a massive technological wall. No one knows how to manufacture blades so thin and so uniform at an industrial scale. That collision between vision and technical reality is what defines this chapter of Gillette's story. An in-between moment where the mind runs ahead of the machines, the desire to change the world gets ahead of the capabilities of workshops and factories. And the next obvious step is no longer in imagination, but in blueprints, in tests, in gears, and in the search for someone capable of turning that desire into real steel. And it is precisely at that point, when the dream is formulated but not yet materialized, that the story stops being theoretical and enters fully into the territory of engineering and the struggle against what, for many, was simply impossible. The battle to tame steel. When King Camp Gillette begins to put his idea into words, the great obstacle stops living in his mind and moves into the cold, rigorous territory of technique. Because one thing is to imagine a tiny blade, perfectly sharpened, mass-produced and so cheap that anyone can throw it away without remorse. And something very different is to confront the laws of metal, the limits of machines, and the stubbornness of a material that understands nothing about business models or visions of the future. By the end of the 1890s, Gillette already has the concept of the safety razor, with disposable blades clearly in mind. But he completely lacks the knowledge needed to make that design real. Thanks to his commercial experience, he knows how to read people, understand markets, and detect habits. But the science of steel and mechanical precision lies far beyond his abilities. The story truly begins to move when William Nickerson enters the scene. A brilliant, trained, methodical engineer, the kind who distrusts vague ideas and needs to see blueprints, measurements, tolerances, and processes before getting excited. Nickerson listens to Gillette's proposal with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, because the idea is bold and commercially seductive. Yet, at first glance, it borders on fantasy. Manufacturing extremely thin steel blades, sharpened on both sides, that maintain their structural integrity during use, and that, on top of that, can be produced by the thousands every day at a cost low enough to allow them to be sold on a massive scale. For an engineer of his time, this represents a serious challenge on several fronts. Steel quality, uniform thickness, edge precision, and the design of machinery capable of making the process repeatable. The first meetings between Gillette and Nickerson reveal an interesting contrast between the broad vision of the entrepreneur and the concrete mindset of the technician. Gillette talks about millions of men shaving every morning with a new system, about packages of blades distributed across the country, about a gigantic business fed by the daily repetition of a gesture as intimate as passing a blade across the face. Nickerson responds with questions about types of steel, heat treatment systems, stamping machines, micron-level tolerances, and production costs. In that mix of languages, it sometimes seems as if they are talking about different things, until they realize that, in reality, they are describing different sides of the same mountain they want to climb. The first major challenge is choosing a steel hard enough to hold an edge, yet malleable enough to be rolled into extremely thin strips without breaking. At that time, the metallurgical industry had already advanced significantly thanks to the needs of railroads, tools, and heavy machinery. But most applications were aimed at robust, thick pieces designed to last. What Gillette was asking for was almost the opposite. Thin, delicate sheets, repeated thousands of times with identical quality. Nickerson immerses himself in testing, analyzes steel suppliers, experiments with different compositions, tests heat treatments seeking the balance between hardness and elasticity, writes reports, and adjusts parameters with the patience of someone who knows that the slightest variation can ruin an entire production run. Meanwhile, Gillette tries to keep the project alive on the financial front. Building specialized machines, renting space, buying steel, and paying salaries require investors, and convincing them is far from easy. Many potential partners look at the early prototypes with distrust. The handle seems reasonable, but the blades are irregular. Some cut too aggressively, others bend easily, others have defective edges that would make any user tremble when bringing them close to the skin. Gillette's passionate and insistent pitch collides with the reality of the numbers. Every failed test is money lost. Every technical improvement demands new investment in machinery or raw materials. and the promise of large future profits still does not offset the immediate risk. Nickerson locks himself into the workshop, surrounded by metallic noise, filings, tools, and small pieces of steel that gradually take shape in a process that is almost artisanal, but aspires to become industrial. First, they must solve the rolling of steel to a thickness far below what is usual, which forces them to modify rollers, adjust pressures, and control temperature with a precision that pushes the limits of what the available machines can handle. Then comes the stamping of the blades, cutting them to exact size, perforating them at the center so they fit into the razor, polishing the edges, and finally, perhaps the most delicate part, sharpening the edges uniformly along the entire piece. Each stage is a potential source of error, and any imperfection will translate into an unpleasant or dangerous shaving experience. On more than one occasion, Nickerson himself doubts that the project can move forward. Machines designed to sharpen knives, scissors, or cutting tools do not work for an object so small and sharpened on both sides, forcing him to imagine new devices, clamping mechanisms, and abrasion systems that allow each blade to be treated precisely without slowing the process to the point of making it economically unviable. It is a constant balancing act. Reduce speed and costs explode. Increase speed and quality collapses. And while all of this is happening in the workshop, Gillette fights another battle, that of other people's trust, defending the vision of a shaving system that still sounds exaggerated to many. Economic pressure tightens. For months, expenses exceed income because the product is not yet ready to be launched on the market. And the few investors who have put in some money begin to grow impatient. Gillette is forced to explain again and again that the key is not having something that is merely similar to what they imagined, but reaching a quality standard so solid that a customer's first contact with the brand creates an immediate sense of safety and efficiency. He knows he is playing a very delicate game. If he releases mediocre blades to relieve financial pressure, the entire concept can be discredited, and the public will associate his name with a dangerous or disappointing invention. That long-term awareness, in the middle of the urgency to pay bills, is one of the hardest decisions he must sustain. Little by little, without great immediate triumphs, only through constant iterations, millimetric adjustments, and endless hours of testing, Nickerson moves closer to a viable formula. He manages to make the rolled steel maintain a uniform thickness, adjusts hardness so the edge withstands several shaves without chipping, designs a sharpening system that works on both sides of the blade with remarkable precision for the time, and perfects the stamping process so that each piece fits exactly into the safety handle. What at first seemed like fantasy begins to turn into a repeatable process. It is still fragile, still in need of refinement, but it is no longer just a drawing on paper. In parallel, Gillette redefines his role within the project. He stops being only the dreamer who talks about the future and becomes a kind of bridge between the technical world and the commercial world. He visits the workshop, watches the machines in operation, learns what he needs in order to explain to others the magnitude of what they are achieving. Then he goes back out, meets with potential partners, writes documents, and presents his vision as a complete system. A simple, robust safety device that anyone can use, combined with a constant supply of perfectly standardized blades. In his discourse, there is a growing conviction, fed by Nickerson's concrete advances, because he is no longer speaking only of possibilities, but of tests, results, and prototypes that work. There is something very powerful in this stage of Gillette's story. The idea that transforming an industry requires more than a good intuition. It requires living for years with the frustration of matter that refuses to obey. Every defective blade, every machine that overheats, Every batch of steel that fails to meet expectations becomes a small defeat piled on top of another and another, until they form a mountain of partial failures. What is extraordinary is that neither Gillette nor Nickerson allows that mountain to crush them. On the contrary, they use it as accumulated experience, as an archive of errors that helps them make more precise decisions in the next steps. When they finally manage to produce a small batch of blades that meet their quality demands, the atmosphere changes. It is not commercial success, not by a long shot, but it does feel like the moment when theory and practice shake hands. Gillette can hold in his fingers the object he has imagined for years, a thin blade, sharpened on both sides, ready to be fitted into a safety handle and face the definitive test. The real skin of a user. That moment, which might seem trivial to someone viewing the story from afar, is for them the result of countless hours of work and risked capital. A demonstration that the impossible idea is beginning to become technically possible. From here on, the focus will no longer be only on taming steel. It will also be necessary to teach the world to trust it, to convince millions of people to change the way they shave, and to accept a completely new system in their daily routine. That will be the next battle. A struggle fought less in workshops and factories and more in the marketplace, in the mind of the consumer, and in the construction of a company capable of carrying this invention to every corner of the planet. The company nobody believed in is born. As the 20th century is about to begin, in 1901, King Camp Gillette takes a step that, for many people around him, borders on absolute recklessness. He decides to turn that strange invention, those ultra-thin blades, and that metal handle that still provoke more doubt than enthusiasm, into the heart of a real company. With bylaws, share capital, partners, obligations, and above all, a gigantic promise toward the future. The Gillette Safety Razor Company is born in a context in which almost no one understands how an entire business could be based on such a small object, so lacking in glamour and so closely tied to an intimate gesture like daily shaving. What for him is the beginning of a global system of recurring consumption. For many investors of the time, looks like the eccentric obsession of a tired salesman who is fixated on a technical whim. The creation of the company is not a romantic act driven by a moment of inspiration. It is the result of a long period of preparation in which Gillette and William Nickerson have finally achieved something that resembles a viable production process. They have already shown that it is possible to manufacture sufficiently uniform blades, that the safety handle protects the user's skin, and that the whole system works in a reasonable way. However, they are still light years away from achieving an industrial scale capable of flooding the market. Right there lies the delicate point. They need money to build factories, improve machinery, and create inventory. But in order to obtain that money, they must convince people who feel no urgency whatsoever to change the way they shave. In meetings with potential investors, the tension between two worlds becomes evident. Gillette arrives with prototypes, documents, cost calculations, and sales estimates that he imagines almost without limits. He speaks of millions of men repeating the same gesture in front of the mirror every morning, of packages of blades that will be worn down and replaced, of margins accumulating day after day, like a kind of constant economic drip that, over time, could turn into a waterfall of income. On the other side of the table, the financiers of the era look at the safety razor as one might look at a sophisticated toy, something perhaps useful for a specific niche, but hard to imagine as the center of an industrial empire. Many of them cling to the logic they have known all their lives. Great fortunes are tied to railroads, construction steel, oil, banking, sectors that raise visible, heavy, impressive infrastructure. An object as small as a shaving razor does not fit into their mental image of what it means to build a powerful company. They struggle to see that true economic power is not always found in the monumental. Sometimes it resides in the tiny and repetitive, in that product that slips into the daily routine and becomes an unavoidable purchase. Gillette, however, remains firm. He knows consumer behavior up close. He has spent too many years observing how decisions are made in shops and at counters to underestimate the force of habit. He knows that if he manages to get men to try his shaving system and feel it to be more comfortable, safer, and more practical than the traditional straight razor, the decision to keep buying blades will become automatic, almost unconscious. His discourse revolves around that idea. He is not selling an isolated object. He is selling a recurring experience, a long-term relationship between the customer's face and his brand. Despite the reluctance, he manages to gather a small group of partners willing to risk capital in the new company. These are not great magnates confident of success, but people who combine curiosity, ambition, and a certain tolerance for risk. For them, the Gillette Safety Razor Company is a risky bet, but also an entry into a commercial territory that, at worst, will be an interesting experiment and, at best, could open an entirely new category. The first corporate records reflect that spirit. Modest capital, a still immature production plan, and an enormous load of hope placed on an invention that is yet to prove anything in the real market. Once the company is founded, another kind of tension begins. The one that exists between the urgency to sell and the need to further perfect production. Gillette assumes the visible role of president, the public face who explains the project, signs agreements, takes care of the global vision, and dreams of expansion. Nickerson remains devoted to the laboratory and the workshop, fine-tuning technical details, adjusting machines, improving blade consistency, and ensuring that the factory can sustain a reasonable flow of units without compromising quality. The company lives in that uncomfortable balance between the world of ideas and the world of numbers, between the passion of the creator and the coldness of accounting statements. In practice, the first months of operation are harsh. Salaries must be paid, raw materials purchased, rent and maintenance costs covered, and at the same time, resources must be allocated to advertising, because such a particular invention needs explanation. People do not wake up one day thinking about replacing their traditional straight razor with something new. So the brand has to gradually plant the idea of safety, comfort, and modernity associated with the new shaving system. Simple advertisements are published in newspapers. Leaflets are distributed. Merchants are persuaded to display the razors in their shop windows. And little by little, the word Gillette begins to be associated with a different, recognizable object. However, what proves most difficult is not explaining how the razor works, but making people understand the business model behind it. Many merchants are used to selling durable straight razors, products with little turnover. Gillette's proposal forces them to think in terms of continuous replacement sales, of returning customers, of a category that becomes recurring. Some understand it immediately and see the potential of having customers come back again and again for new blades. Others remain distrustful and prefer to stick with what they know. The company's early growth is uneven, with areas where the product begins to gain some traction and others where it seems to crash against an invisible wall. At this point in the story, what matters is understanding that the Gillette Safety Razor Company is not born supported by general enthusiasm. There is no wave of acceptance pushing it forward from the first day. What exists is a hard core of conviction in the mind of its founder, reinforced by the strength of the invention and by Nickerson's technical support. While the numbers advance slowly and doubts persist, Gillette insists, refuses to lower the ambition of the project, and avoids falling into the temptation of turning it into a half-measure business. He could have settled for selling the invention to a larger company, delegating responsibility and collecting a moderate sum. But he clings to the idea that this system bears his name and deserves a company built around it. In the modest offices of the company, a strange mix of precariousness and confidence can be felt. There are days when the numbers do not add up, when the future seems fragile and full of conditions. But every time a new order arrives, every time a salesperson returns with the news that a store has repeated an order for blades, the feeling is reinforced that they are knocking on the right door, even if it has not yet fully opened. That dynamic is very characteristic of the beginnings of a large project. From the outside, the company seems almost insignificant. On the inside, there is the certainty that they are building something whose true size has not yet revealed itself. The founding of the company also marks an internal change in Gillette as a person. He stops being a man chasing an invention and becomes an entrepreneur who must think about policies, structures, responsibilities, and the future. He learns to deal with board meetings, discussions about dividends, decisions about reinvesting profits that, at the beginning, are more theoretical than real, but that force him to think long-term. He begins to imagine factories in other states, perhaps in other countries, more ambitious advertising campaigns, agreements with large distribution chains. The brand, in his mind, already lives ahead of its current reality. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the company, the world keeps changing. Cities fill with men who work in offices, shops, railroads, and factories, where discipline and personal appearance begin to matter more and more. Frequent shaving becomes established in many urban cultures as a standard of presentation. And although Gillette does not control that social change, he benefits from it. He is in the right place, with the right product, at the moment when society is gradually willing to adopt a new standard of hygiene. That coincidence between cultural change and technological offering will be one of the keys to later growth. Even so, in these early years, the company lives on the edge of the blade. Never better said, still trying to prove to itself that the invention deserves the structure that has been built around it. What comes next, and what will definitively tip the balance, will be a historical event external to the company. A global fact that will force thousands of men to change their relationship with shaving, and will place the safety razor in the hands of an entire generation almost overnight. From that point on, the story of Gillette will cease to be that of a debated project, and will become that of a brand that expands like an unstoppable wave. The double-edge revolution. When the first commercial units reached the market, in the early years of the 20th century, the invention of King Camp Gillette stops being a workshop hypothesis and becomes something people can hold in their hand, buy in a store, take home, and try in front of the mirror. And that moment marks a before and after. Because for the first time, shaving abandons the hegemony of the traditional straight razor and adopts a completely different form. An elegant metal handle, relatively light, and at the top, a thin, removable blade, sharpened on both sides, held between two plates that prevent the bare edge from reaching the skin with the same violence as a barber's blade. The double-edged design is not an aesthetic whim. It is a statement of engineering and business principles. Because by sharpening the blade on both sides, Gillette multiplies the usefulness of each piece without making manufacturing too expensive, allows the user to turn the blade when one side loses effectiveness, and squeezes the maximum out of each replacement. Something essential in a time when consumers are still not accustomed to throwing away metal without thinking, and at the same time reinforces the sense of industrial precision of an object carefully calculated to take advantage of every millimeter of steel. The user experience changes completely. The user no longer holds a long and dangerous tool. He holds a device that seems designed to protect him from himself. When a man of that era opens for the first time the small box that contains the razor and the blades, he is faced with a new ritual. Instead of drawing a straight razor and checking its edge on a fingernail or on a leather strop, he has to learn to twist the top of the handle, place the blade between two plates, secure it, and notice how only a minimal strip peeks out, just enough to cut the hair without tearing the skin. The gesture is different, and that generates a mixture of distrust and curiosity, because it is logical that many wonder whether something so apparently safe can really offer a close shave, or whether it will remain a mediocre solution for timid people. Here, the psychology of well-designed products comes into play. As the user passes the razor over his face, he discovers that the blade slides at a controlled angle, that the handle offers stability, that the hand does not tremble with the same tension as with the classic straight razor. And little by little, a new sensation settles into the mind. The sensation of being able to shave without constantly worrying about a serious cut. That feeling of control changes the emotional bond with the act of shaving. It stops being an almost solemn moment, reserved for steady hands, and moves closer to a daily task that anyone can perform with a moderate level of skill. What for Gillette is an industrial gamble will become, for millions of men, a silent relief every morning. Alongside the user experience, Gillette deploys a commercial strategy that today seems obvious to us, but that at the time was tremendously innovative. The metal handle, solid and durable, is sold with a very reduced margin and is even given away in certain campaigns, while the real business is concentrated in the replacement blades. The logic is clear. Once the customer gets used to his razor and feels that shaving with that tool is comfortable, he has no reason to change systems, so he will return recurrently to buy new blades, chaining a long-term relationship with the brand. This model, which entire sectors will later copy in the form of printers and cartridges, coffee machines and capsules, or consoles and video games, at that time is perceived as a very bold way of thinking about business, because it requires sacrificing immediate profits in favor of a future income flow. And that implies having confidence in two things: that the product works well enough to generate habit, and that there will be a sufficient base of loyal users to sustain the company's finances. Gillette bets a large part of its future on this logic and reinforces it with a constant advertising presence. The advertisements of the time, printed in newspapers and magazines, show a tone that combines technology, hygiene, and modernity. Gillette presents its double-edged system as the culmination of an advance in personal safety, plays with the idea that an elegant, up-to-date man who lives in a modern city must also be up to the times in the way he shaves. The razor is described as a scientific device, designed with mathematical precision, capable of offering a professional result at home without going to the barber. This message connects with an emerging middle class that wants to appropriate certain personal care practices that previously depended on an exclusive trade. In addition, the brand insists on a key detail. Each Gillette blade always offers the same quality. In a world where manufacturing thousands of identical pieces is still something relatively new, the promise of uniformity generates trust. The customer who buys a package of blades expects all of them to cut in the same way, for the result to be predictable, for there to be no unpleasant surprises. With that, a mental association is built between the brand name and a concrete, repeatable experience. which becomes almost a seal of guarantee. The double edge stops being a technical curiosity and becomes a standard. It should not be forgotten that this revolution, as successful as it may seem in retrospect, does not sweep everything away from the first day. There is cultural resistance. There are barbers who see a direct threat in that device that promises to bring the trade into household bathrooms. There are users loyal to the straight razor who consider it an extension of their adult identity, almost a rite of passage between generations. Gillette must navigate that friction with patience, without openly confronting shaving professionals, but making it clear that the future leans toward user autonomy, toward a more direct relationship between the man and his own personal care. As the product consolidates, the numbers begin to reflect what until then had only been faith. Blade sales grow, the volume of replacements in circulation increases steadily, and the company confirms something it had defended from the beginning. The true treasure is not selling one razor to each man. It is achieving that each of them buys dozens, hundreds of blades throughout his life. The double edge becomes a kind of silent tax on the passing of time. Each week spent translates into a blade that is replaced, into a package that is renewed, into a box that leaves the factory. In product terms, the design of the safety razor with a double-edged blade has an extra advantage. It is relatively easy to transport, to package, to adapt to different markets without changing the essence too much. This makes it easier for the first exports to become a reality, for merchants from other countries to show interest in importing it, for the brand to be placed on the table in business conversations beyond the borders of the United States. Gillette begins to realize that what it has created is not just a national business. It is a concept that can be replicated anywhere men shave frequently. Meanwhile, the culture of male personal care gradually transforms. What was previously associated with the neighborhood barber or with skills belonging to the household begins to be linked to specific brands, to recognizable products. The name Gillette appears on boxes, in advertisements, in conversations. And the double-edged razor becomes an aspirational object, something many want to have on the bathroom shelf because it represents a more modern, more urban lifestyle, more aligned with the new times arriving with the century. The company is doing something more complex than selling metal. It is helping to shape a type of man and a way of presenting oneself to the world. With the system already proven, the double edge established as a symbol of efficiency, and the industrial machinery running at full capacity, the company finds itself prepared to take a leap that is no longer only technological or commercial, but geographic and cultural. The logic of its product fits global trends too well to remain confined to a single country. And the next natural step will be to carry that small pocket object to increasingly distant markets, where the ritual of shaving is also changing and awaits. Perhaps without knowing it, the arrival of a brand willing to occupy that space. Gillette conquers the world. When the company manages to stabilize its production and the double-edged razor establishes itself in the United States market during the early years of the 20th century, the ambition of King Camp Gillette stops looking at the neighborhood, stops looking at the country, and projects itself toward something that, at that moment, was an imposing, almost abstract word: the world. The United States has become the perfect laboratory to refine the product, adjust the business model, and learn how consumers react to a new habit. But Gillette understands that the true potential of his invention does not end in his home country, because shaving is not a local custom. It is a ritual that repeats itself across very different cultures. From major European capitals to port cities in Latin America, passing through colonial territories where the Western style is imposing itself as a reference of modernity. The step from becoming a national brand to aspiring to be a global standard is not trivial. especially in an era in which transportation still depends on ships, in which commercial communications are carried out by letter or telegram, and in which opening a factory on another continent represents a gigantic logistical effort. Gillette, however, relies on a conceptual advantage that few companies had so clearly defined. Its product is conceived from the very beginning as something standardizable, with interchangeable parts and precise measurements that can be replicated again and again in any production plant that follows the same pattern. That mindset of a modular system, of handle and blade perfectly fitted together, allows it to dream of a model in which the user experience is identical in Boston, in London, or in Buenos Aires. The first move abroad comes through exportation, sending batches of razors and blades to distributors in other countries that already have an established commercial network. Those early foreign partners, often merchants who work with imported products from the United States, become the messengers of the brand in markets where no one has yet heard the name Gillette. In the display windows of some shops, boxes begin to appear with the portrait of the founder or with a distinctive logo, and local customers, accustomed to the traditional straight razor or to artisanal products, find themselves facing an object that seems to condense in its design the entire spirit of the new industrial era. The company very quickly understands that selling abroad does not consist solely of shipping boxes. It is necessary to build a narrative that connects with the aspiration for modernity that is already fermenting in many cities around the world. Advertising is adapted, tested in different languages. Messages are adjusted to fit diverse cultural codes. But one central idea is maintained. Shaving with Gillette is aligning oneself with a way of understanding the present time. It is embracing a form of personal hygiene that combines efficiency, safety, and a well-groomed appearance, qualities that are beginning to be indispensable for those who want to advance in the urban and professional life of the early 20th century. As exports grow and orders become more frequent, an important strategic decision emerges. Relying indefinitely on ships loaded from the United States limits the speed of expansion, increases the cost of the product, and makes it vulnerable to any interruption in trade routes. The company then begins to study the idea of building factories outside its country of origin, plants that would allow blades and handles to be produced closer to final consumers, reducing costs and improving delivery times. The logic they apply is the same one they used to move from prototype to industrial system. It is not about improvising. It is about replicating with discipline a process that has already proven to work. The landing in Europe is especially symbolic, because on that continent, deeply rooted barbering traditions mix with an industrial revolution that has been transforming landscapes and customs for decades. Installing factories in strategic places, such as the United Kingdom or France, implies negotiating with governments, adapting to local regulations, hiring workers, training technicians, and securing the supply of suitable steel. But in return, the brand gains something very valuable: physical presence, industrial roots, and a sense of proximity that helps overcome distrust. When a European sees on the box of his blades a reference to a production plant in his own country, he perceives the company as something less exotic and closer to his reality. Shaving becomes a silent language that connects very different cities to one another. Men who will never meet share without knowing it. The gesture of twisting the handle, sliding the double edge across the face, and rinsing it in the same type of porcelain sink, repeated in boarding houses, private homes, barracks, hotels, and passenger ships. Gillette embeds itself in that transnational routine with surprising ease, because the product responds to universal needs: saving time, avoiding cuts, having a presentable appearance to face bosses, clients, colleagues, or even suitors. As urban life organizes itself around increasingly strict schedules, Having a fast and reliable shaving system stops being a luxury and becomes a kind of basic tool for social survival. The brand begins to use a very powerful weapon to consolidate its position in different countries. Consistency. A man who has tried a Gillette razor in the United States and travels to another part of the world can buy blades there and experience exactly the same sensation when shaving. The same resistance of the steel, the same fit in the handle, the same approximate duration of each blade before it loses effectiveness. This precise repetition, which today we take for granted in any global product, was at that time something surprising, almost magical. And it helped build the idea that Gillette was a serious, reliable company, capable of maintaining identical standards thousands of miles away. In many local markets, Gillette's success provokes a defensive reaction from traditional players. Barbers who have inherited the trade from their fathers and grandfathers see how their clients begin to space out their visits, because they now have the possibility of keeping their beards under control at home. Small manufacturers of straight razors, accustomed to selling durable tools with modest margins, discover that their products seem rigid compared to the flexibility of a system that embraces constant replacement. That tension generates debates, newspaper articles, discussions in cafes about whether the industrial shaving machine will ruin the craft of the classic barber, or whether, on the contrary, it opens a new chapter in personal care. Gillette tries to navigate this situation with a mix of firmness and pragmatism. From the company, it is insisted that the safety razor does not seek to destroy the barber's profession, but rather to offer an alternative for daily shaving, leaving the professional the space for special grooming, haircuts, and more elaborate care. In practice, however, the loss of monopoly over shaving is inevitable, and the brand consolidates itself as the preferred option for those who want autonomy and speed. The businessman who travels constantly, the office employee who wakes up early, the merchant who has to open his shop at dawn, all find in Gillette a discreet ally that allows them to fulfill their routine without depending on anyone else's schedule. As the company extends its industrial footprint and its distribution network across different continents, King Gillette watches how an idea that began as a barely understood sketch turns into a growing global phenomenon. In internal reports, there are figures that begin to be dizzying. Millions of blades produced per year, hundreds of thousands of handles in circulation, tons of steel transformed into those tiny objects that disappear into shaving foam and reappear in the accounting books as recurring income. That scale confirms that the vision was not exaggerated, that there truly was room in the world for a product of such frequent use, and that the business model based on replacement works across different cultures, under different languages, and in varied economic contexts. As the brand becomes international, the way the figure of King Gillette himself is perceived also changes. From a stubborn inventor, he comes to be seen as a pioneer of modern consumption, a man who understood that the true revolution is not always in building gigantic machines, but in slipping into the intimacy of millions of bathrooms and turning a routine gesture into the engine of a company that does not stop growing. His portrait appears in more advertisements, his name is printed on more boxes, and his company begins to stop depending on his constant presence and starts to function as a structure with a life of its own, supported by teams, factories, and executives who think in terms of expansion, efficiency, and profits. However, in the midst of this international race, the world is about to enter a turbulent phase that no one can control from a boardroom. The powers arm themselves. Political tensions accumulate. Newspapers speak more and more frequently of alliances, conflicts, and rivalries that go far beyond consumer markets, and without the company having planned it. Its small shaving razor is going to be dragged into a very different scenario, that of equipping soldiers, of life at the front, of military discipline that will transform shaving into a daily obligation and multiply its importance in a way that, until then, no one in the company had imagined. The war that changes everything. When in 1914, Europe erupts into a war that many believed impossible because of its scale, Gillette is already a growing company with international presence, factories outside the United States, and a solid business model based on the constant replacement of blades. However, nothing they had experienced up to that point resembles the earthquake that the First World War is about to cause in their trajectory. Because a conflict of that magnitude alters habits, accelerates decisions, and forces millions of men to adopt a daily discipline that fits almost perfectly with the shaving system the company had been promoting for years. It is one of those moments when global history and business strategy collide in a brutal way, without anyone having been able to plan it like that. As European countries gradually join the conflict and the United States initially maintains a position of neutrality, Gillette continues to operate as usual, producing razors and blades for a civilian market that grows little by little. But the atmosphere changes. International tension can be felt in newspapers, in political speeches, in the streets. And when in 1917 the United States officially enters the war, everyday life in the country is immediately reshaped. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of young men are called up. Training camps are organized, large military bases are created, and the army begins to think about something that goes beyond weapons and uniforms. Hygiene, discipline, and the appearance of each soldier. In that context, shaving takes on a much more serious dimension. Keeping the face clean-shaven is not an aesthetic issue. It is a matter of hygiene, of the correct use of gas masks, of uniformity among the men who are going to fight. The army needs its soldiers to be well shaved on a regular basis, and that requirement fits poorly with the idea of handing out traditional straight razors to millions of inexperienced recruits. Because a long blade handled by nervous, tired people, often in a hurry, is a recipe for cuts, infections, and problems. Safe, easy-to-use shaving tools are needed. Tools that allow any soldier to maintain a proper appearance without constant supervision. It is here that Gillette's path crosses almost inevitably with that of the United States Army. The safety razor with a double-edged blade, designed precisely to reduce risks, presents itself as the perfect solution, almost tailor-made for that new massive need. The company, which had spent years defending the safety of its system compared to the classic straight razor, sees a gigantic opportunity. If it manages to get the government to adopt its product as the standard for soldiers, it will not only gain a client of historic proportions, it will also place its brand in the hands of an entire generation of young men who will soon return to civilian life. Negotiations between the company and the army culminate in an agreement that, over time, will be remembered as one of the great turning points in the history of marketing, although at the time it is experienced mainly as a gigantic logistical operation. Gillette commits to supplying millions of razors and an even larger number of blades to equip American soldiers. The government, for its part, agrees to incorporate those razors into each soldier's personal gear, treating them almost as an essential item, as indispensable as boots or a helmet. Overnight, the invention that years earlier many had seen as a whim begins to be an official part of the military machinery of a country at war. Inside the training camps, the impact is immediate. Each recruit is given a kit with his razor and blades and is instructed on the importance of keeping his face shaved regularly, not out of vanity, but for discipline and health. The Gillette razor becomes an object that accompanies the soldier from dawn until night. A small metal reminder that order and cleanliness are in the midst of chaos, a way to sustain morale. In cold barracks, trenches, and temporary bases, Thousands of men repeat the same gesture every morning, leaning over buckets of water, using the same type of handle, hearing the same brief sound of the blade tearing through early stubble. From a business perspective, this episode means something enormous. All at once, Gillette achieves what any brand dreams of: a massive and unavoidable demonstration of its product before a specific audience, young, and with a very intense emotional bond to its experience. Many of those soldiers had never used a safety razor before the war. They were used to going to the village barber or shaving with rudimentary tools. And suddenly they discover that they can keep their beard under control with a more comfortable and less dangerous system. In an environment where almost everything is harsh, uncomfortable, and hostile, having something that works, that always responds the same way, that allows at least one moment of recognizable routine, becomes a small relief that leaves a lasting mark. Gillette's factories operate at a frantic pace to meet military demand. Blade production skyrockets, machines run for longer hours, more staff is hired, shifts are reorganized, and processes are reviewed to avoid quality failures that under normal circumstances would already be worrying, but that in wartime can become a serious problem. Any defective batch could mean thousands of soldiers having a bad experience, and the company knows it is not just risking a one-time contract. It is risking its reputation before an audience that will soon disperse across the entire country, carrying with it its opinion of the brand. The long-term effect of this move is better understood when the war ends. Between 1918 and 1919, soldiers begin to return home. They come back tired, marked by what they have seen, eager to recover a civilian life that will no longer be the same as before. But one of the habits they bring back with them is shaving with a safety razor. Many of them have spent months, even years, using a Gillette razor every day, becoming familiar with how to hold it, with the feeling of the blade on the skin, with the logic of changing the blades when they lose effectiveness. When they return to their homes, their towns, their cities, it feels natural to continue using the same system, this time in a calmer environment. It is at that moment that the strategic move of the war shows its true scope. Gillette does not have to convince those millions of men from scratch. It does not have to explain what a safety razor is, nor why it is better than a straight razor. They already know. They have already used it. They have already integrated it into their routine. And all they need now is to keep buying blades. The business model based on replacement thus finds the perfect foundation. An entire generation of users trained in the use of the product under the rigid structure of the army, who now become natural customers of the civilian market. In addition, these soldiers do not return to a social vacuum. They return to communities where their word carries weight. What they recommend, what they use, what they bring back as habits from the front, influences friends, family members, co-workers. It is easy to imagine the scene of a young man teaching his father how to use a Gillette razor, explaining that in the army everyone used it, that it was faster, safer, that it worked even under extremely uncomfortable conditions. That legitimacy born from extreme experience acts as a gigantic organic marketing campaign impossible to buy with traditional advertising money. The figures the company handles at the end of the conflict make it clear that something profound has changed. Blade sales multiply. The number of razors in circulation reaches levels that would have seemed fantastical a few years earlier. And the brand consolidates itself as a synonym for modern shaving in much of the Western world. The war, with all its brutality, has been an accelerator of habits, and Gillette has known how to position itself at the exact point where a military necessity and its value proposition converge perfectly. At the same time, this success lays the groundwork for a new phase in the company, a stage in which it is no longer enough to be the pioneer of the safety razor. Because competition begins to awaken, other companies observe the replacement model, study patents, look for legal gaps, analyze the possibility of offering alternatives. Gillette has gained a privileged position thanks to the war. But from now on, it will have to learn how to defend it in times of peace, with smart campaigns, with complex business decisions, and with leadership that will be subjected to new internal and external tensions that will go far beyond the battlefield. The decline of the man who started the revolution. As the 1920s begin to unfold, with their illuminated cities, automobiles roaring down the avenues, and an air of economic optimism that seems to envelop everything, the Gillette Company is living through one of its finest moments, driven by wartime contracts, by the mass adoption of the safety razor, and by a replacement system that has become an almost inexhaustible money-printing machine. And yet, in the midst of that upward curve, the man who gave it his name and face begins to feel increasingly distant from the heart of decision-making, as if his own creation had stretched so far that he could no longer fully embrace it. King Camp Gillette, the obsessive salesman, the inventor who fought against steel, the entrepreneur who stood on the brink of financial failure on several occasions, reaches maturity with the bitter sensation that the company he imagined to fit his own measure has begun to operate under a different logic, guided by other interests, other rhythms, other priorities. When a company moves from being a small, almost family-run project to becoming a corporation with shareholders, a board of directors, professional executives, and layers of middle management, the role of the founder often enters a complicated gray zone. In the early years, his opinion is unquestionable. His intuition weighs more than any report. His story inspires employees and investors. But as the numbers grow and markets become more complex, voices emerge that speak of efficiency, profitability, cost control, scalability, words supported by charts, balance sheets, and forecasts that do not always align with the emotional vision of the creator. Gillette, with his idealistic character and strong ego, begins to clash with a new generation of executives who do not see him as a hero, but as a respectable figure, yes, yet also as someone whose impulsiveness can put at risk decisions that demand cool-headedness. During those years, King Gillette is also carried away by a type of thinking that gradually distances him from the concrete terrain of the company and draws him into social and utopian projects of enormous scale. He publishes ideas about perfect communities, planned industrial cities, models of society in which private property dissolves and well-being is organized as a centralized system. Almost a kind of ideal city where millions of people would live together under a rational scheme of work and consumption. His fascination with these utopian visions, which for him are consistent with the idea of optimizing human life, begins to generate discomfort among some shareholders, who would rather see him focused on strengthening the core business instead of imagining futuristic cities governed by almost philosophical principles. That intellectual turn is accompanied by questionable financial decisions. Over time, Gillette gradually loses his stake in the company, selling shares to finance personal projects, dubious investments, or simply to sustain a standard of living that, with fame and success, has become increasingly expensive. Without realizing it, the founder who once controlled the course of the company ends up in a vulnerable position within his own board, with less real power than his surname on the boxes might suggest. The company no longer depends on his vote to set major directions. It depends on investment groups, on executives experienced in international expansion, on people for whom King is important, but expendable. The contrast between the epic nature of his early years and the reality of this stage is especially harsh. While he watches Gillette become a global synonym for shaving, while he hears sales figures that surpass what his imagination could have endured in the beginning, he realizes that he is consulted less and less, that his opinions dissolve into meeting minutes where his signature coexists with many others, that concepts such as return for the shareholder or market value carry more weight than his insistence on associating the brand with certain ideals of well-being, hygiene, and human progress. The man who dreamed of changing the world through a small metal object finds himself, in a way, pushed aside by the very structure he built. This type of story repeats itself again and again in business life. The visionary entrepreneur, indispensable in the phase of creation and extreme risk, loses ground when the company enters a consolidation mode, when the risk is no longer whether the invention works, but how to defend a leadership position, how to extract the maximum value from a competitive advantage in an environment full of alert competitors. King Gillette, accustomed to thinking in terms of rupture and radical difference, feels uncomfortable in a world where the conversation revolves around optimizing margins, refining supply chains, and negotiating with bankers. As if that were not enough, his idealistic character leads him to imagine that the company could be something more than a profit-generating machine. He even proposes that Gillette, with its constant flow of income, could support large-scale social transformation projects, finance model cities, reform the economic system from within a large corporation that would not limit itself to pursuing financial gain. These ideas, which seem to him a natural evolution of his personal story, sound in the ears of the other board members like dangerous fantasies, possible distractions from the main objective. There is a deep gap between the man who sees his company as a tool to redesign society and those who see it as a vehicle for generating returns on investment. Little by little, and almost without a precise date of dramatic rupture, the founder is displaced from the front line. He remains present in the brand's imagery, his face is used in some materials, his name is on every box. But effective control passes into other hands. It is a kind of elegant exile. No one expels him in a humiliating way, but decision-making circles close around professional executives, lawyers, financiers, people who approach the company as an entity that must survive beyond the person who created it. King grows old watching his invention become an institution, and at the same time, he feels a mixture of pride and melancholy that is difficult to balance. In his private life, that sense of having been set aside pushes him even further toward his utopian projects. He continues writing, imagining, debating, obsessed with the idea that the economic system could be organized in a fairer way, with less waste and more collective planning. It is as if the man who once fought against the limitations of steel is now fighting against the limitations of capitalism itself, trying to propose alternatives from the margins. This curious drift turns him into a singular figure, a magnate turned critic of the very system that gave him the wealth necessary to live comfortably, a businessman who, in his old age, feels closer to the role of social reformer than to that of a classic industrialist. From the outside, the paradox is evident. The brand advances toward a phase of extreme professionalization, relies on increasingly sophisticated advertising campaigns, learns to speak the aspirational language of the masses, while the man who appears in many of those corporate stories walks toward the exit, with the feeling of having been overwhelmed by something he himself set in motion. That friction between the person and the institution leaves a lesson that repeats itself in many business biographies. The success of an invention can make a company gigantic, and that greatness, once achieved, rarely obeys a single will. King Camp Gillette dies in 1932. With the company already established as a global benchmark and in the midst of a world going through another monumental crisis, the Great Depression, which once again questions the foundations of the economic system. He leaves with the certainty of having changed something as elemental as the way men shave, but also with the wound of having lost control of his creation long before leaving this world. In his story, there is brilliance and shadow, triumph and loss, creation and displacement. And that entire journey illuminates an uncomfortable idea for any entrepreneur. Sometimes, for a brand to become an institution, the founder must accept that the spotlight shifts to others. As the figure of Gillette gradually fades in the corridors of corporate power and becomes more a symbol than an actor, the company fully enters a phase in which the construction of public image becomes as important as the manufacturing of blades. The product is already in millions of bathrooms. Now the challenge will be to consolidate what people feel when they see its name printed, to speak to the consumer from shop windows, newspapers, radios, and billboards, and to turn that small metal razor into a cultural icon capable of representing something more than a simple gesture in front of the mirror. The era of iconic campaigns, when the name of King Camp Gillette begins to fade within organizational charts and the company enters that phase of cold, almost bureaucratic professionalization, the strategic focus shifts forcefully toward a field that, in the early years, had been secondary. The construction of the brand as a character, as a voice, as a constant presence in the consumer's mind. And there, in the central decades of the 20th century, Gillette understands that the battle is no longer about proving that its product works, because that is more than established, but about associating its razor with a clear idea of what it means to be a man, to be successful, to belong to modernity. The double-edged blade remains the heart of the business, but now the symbolic wrapping begins to weigh as much as the steel itself. During the years of the Great Depression, while millions of people lose jobs, homes, and savings, the company faces a delicate challenge. How to keep selling a recurrent consumption product when the priority for many people is simply making it to the end of the month. Executives know that shaving does not disappear from routine, but it can be postponed, spaced out, adapted to suffocating household economies. Gillette's response is not limited to lowering prices or launching promotions. It is built around an emotional message. In difficult times, maintaining a dignified, presentable, clean appearance is a way of resisting, of preserving a certain sense of control amid chaos. Advertisements from the period show well-shaved men looking for work, attending interviews, preparing for their opportunity with the razor in hand, as if that small gesture in front of the mirror were the first step toward recovery. Little by little, advertising language becomes more sophisticated. The product stops being presented solely as a tool and begins to turn into a mirror of aspirations. Gillette does not speak only of a face without a beard. It speaks of a man who takes care of himself, who respects others by presenting himself with a good appearance, who honors work and family. A narrative is built in which proper shaving is a kind of civilian uniform, the way the ordinary man rises to the level of his responsibilities. That mental framework reinforces the almost obligatory nature of the razor, integrating it into a social code where appearing unkempt is interpreted as a lack of discipline. With the expansion of radio first and television later, Gillette fully enters the game of major sponsors, those names that accompany sporting events, entertainment programs, and mass broadcasts. The brand becomes especially linked to sports, and very specifically to baseball in the United States, understanding that there lies a perfect symbolic territory. Effort, competitiveness, teamwork, self-improvement. For years, millions of people listened to games accompanied by mentions of Gillette, advertising spots with catchy jingles and messages that directly connect the idea of a man who performs with a man who shaves with Gillette. That kind of association is a masterstroke in brand identity construction. When a father takes his child to a game, and in the stadium, on the radio, or on television the name Gillette appears alongside the sports heroes of the moment, a silent line is drawn in the child's mind. The players he admires, the commentators who narrate the game, the men who fill the stands and celebrate victories, all are crossed by the discreet presence of that name. Years later, when that child becomes an adult and has to choose a razor on a shelf, the brand will not be a stranger. It will be the echo of an iconography that has long been circling his memory. In parallel, the company begins to pay special attention to the aesthetics of its printed advertisements. Illustrations of well-shaved men gradually give way to more powerful photographs, with faces that look as if they came out of a film, with marked jaws, determined gazes, and well-tailored suits. Gillette subtly proposes a very specific model of masculinity. Someone who wakes up early, works hard, takes responsibility for his destiny, and presents himself to the world with a clean face as visible proof that he takes his life seriously. The razor functions as a symbol of self-control, of self-care, of readiness to face the day. With the arrival of television on a massive scale, the brand becomes a familiar presence in households through commercials that condense stories into a few seconds. The man who shaves before an important date. The father who teaches his teenage son to use a razor for the first time. The employee who looks at himself in the mirror before a crucial meeting. Each piece builds the idea that shaving marks the beginning of meaningful moments, that it is a step taken before entering the stage of everyday life. The writers of these campaigns understand that if they manage to make the viewer feel that this gesture is loaded with meaning, the decision of which razor to use will happen almost automatically. The strength of these iconic campaigns lies not only in their creativity, but in their coherence over time. Gillette reinforces the same pillars again and again: safety, precision, modernity, and personal success, even as the world changes at dizzying speeds, with wars, crises, the loosening of customs, and cultural transformations. The brand strives to maintain a recognizable line. This allows very different generations to feel that, even if the context shifts, there is something stable in that small metallic object, something that keeps it relevant as a trusted tool. The accumulated effect of these campaigns is impressive from an entrepreneurial perspective. Gillette demonstrates that once a product has reached its ceiling in technological terms within its category, the next level of differentiation is played out in the realm of perceptions, narrative, and emotion. There may be many competitors. Similar razors may appear on the market. But a brand's ability to be present in culture, in jokes, in conversations, in memories, that ability is built over decades of consistent messages that adapt to the medium without betraying the core. Campaigns with a more aspirational tone also begin to appear, aligned with an idea of masculine progress linked to professional success and romantic attraction. The man who shaves well has more options, more respect, more impact on others. That is the subtext repeated in many advertisements. From today's perspective, this type of message may seem simplistic or excessively centered on a stereotype. But at the time, it connects with a very widespread sensitivity and reinforces the idea that it is not just about removing hair. It is about assuming a social role marked by performance and impeccable personal presentation. In some markets, Gillette also begins to speak directly to women, not so much as users, but as prescribers. Advertisements appear in which the female partner positively values the man who presents himself well-shaved. It is suggested that taking care of one's appearance is also a form of respect toward the person with whom one shares life, and that choosing the right razor is part of that responsibility. In this way, the brand infiltrates more than one purchasing decision, that of the man who shaves, that of the woman who can influence which product enters the household. All this global advertising deployment has one gentle consequence and another more demanding one for the company. The gentle one is that Gillette becomes consolidated as a synonym for shaving in many parts of the planet, to the point that in some countries people use its name to refer to any razor even if it is not from the brand. The demanding one is that, having built an image of technical excellence and permanent modernity, the company becomes obliged to live up to that image every time the technological environment changes. Because one thing is repeating oneself in advertisements, and another very different thing is confronting an innovation that threatens to displace the entire system on which the business has been built. And that is precisely what begins to appear on the horizon as the decades advance. The emergence of electric shavers, systems that promise speed without foam, without blades to replace, without the complete ritual that Gillette had spent years reinforcing in its communication. Suddenly, shaving enters a new phase of technological competition, and the iconic campaigns, as memorable as they may be, will have to coexist with a different challenge, one in which the company must prove that it knows how to reinvent itself without losing the essence that has carried it to that privileged position it now occupies. The arrival of electric shaving. As the calendar moves toward the decades of 1930 and 1940, the world of shaving, which seemed to be territory fully conquered by double-edged blades and safety razors, begins to feel a different vibration. A technological murmur born in laboratories and workshops where some engineers look at the male face as just another surface that can be dominated by electricity and not by bare steel handled by hand. Gillette, which has spent years reigning over the realm of disposable blades, watches with a certain curiosity and even slight disdain those first electric shavers that appear in timid advertisements and occasional shop windows, bulky, corded, noisy devices that promise something as provocative as shaving without foam, without water, and without blades to replace. The idea that an electric machine with an internal motor and oscillating blades protected by a grid could replace the ritual of the disposable blade seems, at first, like an exotic experiment, almost a whim for those who love technical novelty more than real comfort. In those early models, there is a tension between promise and execution. The promise of speed, of less irritation, of less preparation, set against an execution that is still imperfect, with uneven closeness, mechanical noise, and the need to depend on a power outlet or batteries that, in those early years, bear little resemblance to what we know today. From Gillette's offices, these devices are examined closely, studied, tested, but many executives agree on a simplifying diagnosis. It may be a fad, it may be a side segment. It does not seem capable of tearing down the blade system that has turned the company into a giant. However, business history is full of moments in which the comfort of the leader becomes the greatest ally of those who arrive with a disruptive approach. And electric shaving presents itself precisely as a disruption of the user experience. Instead of foam, brush, sink, and preparation, it proposes a gesture that fits better with a type of urban man who lives in a hurry, who travels, who values time above ritual, who is willing to sacrifice a bit of closeness in exchange for not having to deal with a wet blade every morning. What is fascinating is that this proposal does not compete only on technical grounds. It competes on how the day is organized, on lifestyle itself. In some markets, especially in the United States and in Europe, brands such as Schick and Remington begin to appear, willing to make electric shaving their banner. Their advertisements show modern men, often in elegant interiors, passing a machine over their faces with a calm smile, without foam, without a towel, without the slightest trace of complication. The message is clear. While others remain tangled in the old sink routine, you can shave dry, seated, even before putting on your tie. This type of narrative indirectly attacks the heart of the ritual that Gillette had been building for decades in its campaigns. That solemn moment in front of the mirror with the razor in hand. Inside Gillette, the reaction is neither immediate nor uniform. There are executives who believe that electric shaving is only a complement, an alternative for a specific niche, and that the great market will continue to be disposable blades. Because they are cheaper, offer a closer shave, and adapt better to established habits. Others, however, detect a deeper threat. If electric machines become cheaper, if they improve their performance, if they become a frequent gift for birthdays, Christmas, or celebrations, they could establish themselves as a strong option in middle-class homes, gradually reducing demand for traditional blades. That strategic tension translates into internal debates about whether the company should fully enter the electric field or focus on further perfecting its blade system. The decision is complex, because embracing electric shaving means challenging its own business model. While blades generate a constant flow of income, the electric machine is purchased once and amortized over years, relying on replacements and maintenance that, in practice, do not have the same frequency or the same margin. It is almost as if the very financial concept on which Gillette built its empire is questioned by a new technology that does not play by the same rules. For a time, the company underestimates the pace at which electric shaving is gaining ground. Blade sales figures remain very strong. The business continues to grow. There are new countries to conquer and segments to deepen. So the urgency does not seem extreme. However, among certain consumer groups, especially men who travel often or those who place great value on convenience, electric machines begin to consolidate. They do not completely replace the traditional razor, but they displace it at certain times of day, on certain days of the week, in certain stages of life. And that partial substitution is already enough to set off alarms. At the same time, the world is experiencing a new wave of technological advances on many fronts. Household appliances, radios, television, automobiles. The home fills with devices that promise to reduce manual effort and save time. And in that context, the electric shaver stops looking like a strange luxury and becomes just another piece of the puzzle, alongside the blender, the vacuum cleaner, or the washing machine. The man who buys technology for his home sees the shaver as another extension of that mechanized lifestyle. For Gillette, which had always known how to position itself as a symbol of modernity, it is uncomfortable to cede that ground to others, because the association between new and electric becomes very powerful. The company tries to defend its position by emphasizing the superiority of the blade shave, the sensation of freshness after passing the razor with foam and water, the control offered by a well-executed clean cut. In advertising, the idea of precision and detailed care is stressed. Electric machines are presented as something less demanding, suitable for quick solutions, but far from the perfection that can be achieved with a good blade. However, basing the defense solely on the quality of the result is not enough, because more and more consumers prioritize the overall experience. which includes time, comfort, preparation, and in many cases, the simple appeal of using an electric device that hums and vibrates in the hand. Faced with this landscape, Gillette is forced to reconsider its product innovation strategy. The arrival of electric shaving acts as a reminder that leadership is not secured only through brilliant campaigns and massive distribution. It requires attention to any change in habits that might reconfigure the playing field. Although the company decides to concentrate its resources on continuing to perfect blade shaving, the presence of electric competition forces it to accelerate its pace, to explore new configurations, to think about more comfortable and more intuitive systems that reduce friction in the process and make it even more attractive compared to plugged-in machines. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this moment in Gillette's history is especially interesting because it shows how a consolidated company with a dominant product can feel threatened by an advance it initially dismisses. Electric shaving does not destroy the disposable blade business, but it teaches it its limits, marks the areas where it is vulnerable, and reminds it that no monopoly of habit is eternal. Every machine that someone receives as a gift and uses from then on is a small reminder that the future can diverge along paths the market leader did not fully anticipate. Gillette's long-term response will be to understand that the path forward does not lie in denying outside innovation, but in adopting a more aggressive mindset toward its own evolution, seeking to ensure that the blade system continues to offer a value proposition so strong that even surrounded by technological alternatives, it can remain the reference. And that search for a new way to put steel at the service of the face, to simplify blade replacement even further, and to encapsulate the experience in a more comfortable and efficient format, will end up pushing the company toward one of the most important decisions in its history. One of those product transformations that redefined for decades the way millions of people shave every morning. The decisive leap to the Trac Two system. By the end of the 1960s, in the midst of a climate of social change, cultural revolutions, the massive arrival of household appliances into the home, and the first serious steps of the space race, a different kind of revolution was taking shape inside Gillette's laboratories. It was far less spectacular at first glance, but just as ambitious. The idea that the razor blade, that seemingly simple fragment of steel, could enter a new stage if the way it had worked for decades was questioned at its very root. The double edge had been a stroke of genius. The safety razor had become a symbol of the brand. But competitors had already learned how to manufacture similar products, and electric shaving threatened the dominance of the classic ritual. Standing still meant beginning to fall behind. In that context, amid technical meetings and research sessions, an intuition that had been circulating among several engineers for some time began to gain strength. If one blade cuts well, perhaps two blades aligned in a specific way could achieve something a single one never could. A closer, smoother shave, with fewer passes over the skin and less irritation afterward. The idea was not simply to duplicate the number of edges, but to rigorously study how beard hair behaves when it comes into contact with a blade. What happens to the skin when it is stretched? How a microscopic hair deforms at the exact instant the blade grazes it. It is almost a miniature physics laboratory scene applied to the human face. Gillette invests in studying this phenomenon, analyzing with cameras and magnification what had previously been treated almost like an empirical art. Scientists observe that when a blade passes over a hair, it stretches it slightly before cutting it. And in the microsecond in which it is released, that hair tends to retract a little below the surface of the skin. From there, a fascinating possibility opens up. If a first blade passes and stretches the hair, and a second blade, placed at a millimetric distance, acts immediately afterward, It can take advantage of that stretching to cut closer, producing a result that, in theory, feels smoother for more hours. On that conceptual foundation, the Trac Two system is born, which will be launched to the market in 1971. The novelty is not only that the cartridge contains two aligned blades, it lies in the entire design surrounding that double blade. For the first time, Gillette clearly moves away from the classic image of the double-edged razor, with a head that is unscrewed and a flat blade placed inside, and bets on a system of prefabricated cartridges that snap directly into the handle through a simple mechanism. Each cartridge integrates the two blades into a rigid structure, with the exact angle, the optimal separation between them, and a plastic housing that, although discreet, represents a very significant industrial leap. The engineer working on Trac Two is no longer designing a simple blade, but creating a small precision module, a piece in which different materials, complex manufacturing processes, and much more demanding quality controls come into play. The steel must be rolled and sharpened with minimal tolerances. The structure that supports the blades has to guarantee that the angle remains stable through dozens of shaves. And the system that locks into the handle cannot fail or loosen with water and soap. It is a product that blends metallurgy, plastics, industrial design, and ergonomics in a far more advanced way than previous models. From the business model perspective, Trac Two takes Gillette's logic to a new depth. With the double-edged razor, blades were consumables, but there was a certain level of compatibility between brands, and users could, in some cases, combine a handle from one manufacturer with blades from another. The cartridge system changes the rules of the game. The handle is designed to work only with the brand's specific cartridges, with a patented locking system that reinforces the bond between the customer and Gillette. Once someone adopts Trac Two, the likelihood of switching to another supplier drops considerably, because doing so would require replacing both the handle and the refill. The launch is supported by a communication campaign that seeks to educate the user in this new logic without making him feel clumsy or outdated. Advertisements show illustrations and animations where the beard is seen in cross-section, being attacked by the two blades in a coordinated way, almost like a microscopic choreography. The first lifts, the second finishes. The language blends science and everyday life. Speaking of technology at the service of daily shaving, of millimetric precision applied to a gesture a man repeats countless times throughout his life. The promise is direct. A closer shave, with fewer repetitions over the same area and a prolonged sensation of smoothness. At first, not all consumers are convinced. Some look at the new system with suspicion, thinking it is an unnecessary complication, a way to sell something more expensive by taking advantage of the brand's reputation. Others are drawn to the idea of using the latest, the equivalent of driving a next-generation car in a world where technology has become a symbol of status. Gillette has to manage this adoption process without alienating loyal users of the double edge, to whom it had spent decades saying that their razor was unbeatable. The discourse becomes less dogmatic and more evolutionary. What was once the best possible solution now gives way to an improvement supported by science and accumulated experience. In bathrooms across half the world, for a time, old metal razors with unscrewable heads begin to coexist with the new Trac Two handles, more streamlined, with interchangeable cartridges that slide into place with a brief click. The moment of changing the cartridge becomes an almost satisfying experience for some users, similar to installing a new component in a precision device. Suddenly, keeping the tool sharp no longer involves unscrewing, aligning, and handling loose blades, and is simplified into a clean gesture. Remove one module, insert another. From the perspective of product engineering, Trac Two marks the beginning of a stage in which the handle stops being a simple support and becomes a piece with greater aesthetic and functional prominence. Gillette begins to experiment with more ergonomic grips, with textures that improve hold, with a design that seeks to convey robustness and modernity at the same time. The user no longer buys just blades. He buys a system, a whole designed to function in harmony, almost as if he were holding a semi-professional tool adapted for domestic use. This leap has another strategic consequence. It forces competitors to catch up in a race of patents, designs, and results. Companies such as Schick, which had already been applying pressure, react with their own cartridge proposals, sometimes seeking legal loopholes to approach the concept without violating Gillette's patents. Other times trying to differentiate themselves through technical details or communication. The battlefield ceases to be exclusively the individual blade and shifts to the terrain of the complete system, where both shaving effectiveness and the sense of ease and loyalty generated by the ecosystem of refills matter. In the years following the launch, results end up validating the bet. Trac Two achieves progressive adoption, especially among urban middle-class men, open to incorporating technology into their routines and willing to pay a bit more for a better experience. Many people who had flirted with the idea of electric shaving, attracted by the promise of convenience, return to the world of the blade upon discovering that the new two-blade system achieves a very appealing balance between closeness and practicality. Gillette thus reinforces its position at a moment when external pressures could have pushed it into a slow decline. For anyone observing the story from an entrepreneurial perspective, the move toward Trac Two leaves several clear lessons. The first is that a market leader has two enemies: its direct competitors and its own complacency. Gillette avoided falling into the latter precisely because it accepted that the double edge, however magnificent it had been in its time, needed to be surpassed. The second lesson is that innovating within one's own model, rather than abandoning it, can be a far more powerful formula than trying to imitate the solutions of others. Instead of becoming an electric machine company and betraying its essence, the company asked how it could take steel, its historical raw material, to a new level. With Trac Two, Gillette makes it clear that it has entered an era in which battles will no longer be fought solely over who has the best blade, but over who best understands the combination of technology, habits, intellectual property, and business model. And as the two-blade system consolidates, the competitive environment begins to heat up. Patent lawsuits become more frequent, advertising campaigns are sharpened just like steel, and other brands prepare to dispute, millimeter by millimeter, a territory that for a long time had seemed to be the exclusive property of a single name. Fierce competition. Schick and beyond. When the Trac Two system begins to settle into the market during the decade of 1970, Gillette could have allowed itself a certain sense of self-satisfaction because it had achieved something difficult: reinventing its own invention and maintaining leadership in a category that already had decades of history. But competitive reality grants no rest. And very soon the company discovers that the real test was not launching a razor with two blades, but sustaining that advantage in an environment where other brands, especially Schick and Wilkinson Sword, are willing to fight for every inch of shelf space, every advertisement, every gesture of the consumer in front of the mirror. Shaving becomes a silent battlefield, as intense as any price war in supermarkets or telecommunications. Schick, which has been building its own reputation for some time with blade injection systems and designs alternative to the classic model, interprets Trac Two as a declaration of technological war. If Gillette has been able to move from one blade to two, they cannot afford to appear as resigned followers. they must offer something that sounds just as advanced, or even more so, and that can also be positioned as a differentiated option with its own personality. From this logic emerge proposals such as razors with pivoting heads, encapsulated blade injection systems, and designs that seek to convey a sense of refined engineering in contrast to the apparent blunt force of the industry giant. Meanwhile, Wilkinson's sword enters the scene with a different weapon, never better said, because its origin as a manufacturer of swords and knives allows it to exploit a distinct narrative. That of perfect steel, impeccable sharpness, centuries of tradition applied to the shaving blade. With its coated blade, specific hardening technologies, and a positioning that appeals to almost surgical precision, it presents itself as a premium alternative in several markets, especially in Europe. The consumer suddenly finds several brands competing not only on price, but on technical promises. Double blades, special coatings, moving heads, different loading mechanisms. This scenario pushes Gillette to definitively abandon any temptation to rest on its own pioneer narrative. The company strengthens its research and development departments, increases investment in laboratories, hires material scientists, mechanical engineers, plastic specialists, and experts in fluid dynamics who study how foam and water circulate around the blade. The razor, which for many users remains a simple object, becomes internally a high-technology project where every micrometer of metal, every plastic groove, and every lubricating strip goes through simulations, stress tests, and behavioral studies. In parallel with this technological race, the war is fought with equal intensity in the aisles of supermarkets and pharmacies. Large retail chains understand the strategic value of the shaving category, a product of recurring purchase, attractive margins, and the ability to generate store traffic. Purchasing managers negotiate tough conditions with all brands, demand discounts, promotions, special packs, end cap displays, and every centimeter of visibility is negotiated as if it were a small sovereign territory. Gillette uses its weight as leader to secure privileged positions, but Schick and other competitors push with aggressive offers and specific agreements. At this point in the story, razor blades and cartridge systems increasingly resemble the soft drink or detergent industries, where the product matters, but distribution and mental presence matter just as much or more. Gillette has an accumulated advantage in brand recognition and trust, but competitors try to counter it with concrete innovations. New blade geometries, materials that promise less irritation, lubricating strips infused with soothing substances, handle designs that resemble next-generation ergonomic tools. Each launch tries to communicate that the previous product has been surpassed, that anyone who wants to stay up to date must adopt the new system. In this environment of fierce competition, disposable razors also appear, a concept that gains traction in many markets during the 1970s and 1980s. Bic bursts forcefully into this category, proposing something radically simple: a complete plastic razor with an integrated blade that is used for a handful of shaves and then thrown away entirely. This idea fits with the culture of fast consumption, immediate solutions, products that require almost no maintenance. For Gillette, which has always built its economic model around a durable handle and a high-margin refill, disposables represent an uncomfortable challenge because they change the psychology of purchase. Instead of investing in a system, the customer buys shaves in multi-packs. The company reacts with a mix of pragmatism and pride. On one hand, it decides to enter the disposable category with its own models, so as not to give that segment away to competitors. On the other, it strives to position its cartridge systems as the superior option, both in performance and in experience. The strategy consists of offering several product tiers for different budgets and moments of use. Disposables for travel, occasional use, or tight budgets. And advanced systems for those who want a higher quality shave and are willing to pay more for it. That segmentation helps defend market share. But it also generates internal complexity, because it forces the company to manage multiple production lines and marketing messages at the same time. Behind the glossy advertisements and shelves full of colors, there is a less visible battle, that of patents and courtrooms. Gillette and its competitors closely monitor any new technical feature in their products, register designs, claim intellectual property rights, and when they feel invaded, file lawsuits. Patent-specialized lawyers become key actors, analyzing to what extent a competitor's pivoting head copies or does not copy a protected solution, debating whether a lubricating strip with a specific formula violates a prior registration, negotiating settlements to avoid more costly rulings. This legal war, although seemingly far removed from the consumer's bathroom, shapes many design decisions and launch schedules. Meanwhile, the social and cultural context continues to shift. Beard fashions come and go. Periods appear where a clean-shaven face is almost mandatory for certain jobs, and others where dense beards or three-day stubble become fashionable in cinema, music, or advertising. For a company that lives off selling shaving, every wave of facial hair poses a communication challenge. It must adapt its discourse without betraying itself. Gillette learns to speak of shaping instead of removing, presents its blades as tools for defining beards, mustaches, and sideburns, and expands its catalog to electric trimmers so as not to be trapped in a single facial style. In emerging markets, the battle takes on another form. Countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa become priority territories for growth. But their average purchasing power is lower, and distribution channels function differently. Gillette must adjust prices, sales formats, package sizes, and even adapt part of its message to cultures where the relationship with facial hair does not match that of Western countries. Local competition, often with cheaper and less sophisticated products, puts pressure on the entry segment, forcing the company to be creative in order not to sacrifice margin while also not losing relevance. Amid all this noise, the brand understands that its long-term survival is not decided in a single battle, but in the accumulation of many well-made decisions. Which patents to pursue and which to ignore, which markets to invest in first, which segments to prioritize when resources are not enough for everything. How to maintain an image of cutting-edge leadership when so many brands are trying to claim the word innovation. Gillette's historical reputation gives it time, but it does not guarantee automatic victories, and management knows it. This period of fierce competition, with Schick, Wilkinson, Bic, and other players pressing from different flanks, acts as a kind of extreme training for the company. It forces it to work with shorter innovation cycles, to listen more closely to consumers, to test prototypes with real user groups, to study irritation, closeness of the shave, subjective sensations, and to translate all that knowledge into products that are truly perceived as an advance, not as a simple cosmetic exercise. From this constant pressure will be born Gillette's next major bet, a project that will consume years of work, thousands of tests, and a multi-million investment in advanced technology with one very clear objective: to once again redefine the standard of shaving and raise a new barrier to entry that competitors will take years to overcome. The Mach 3 revolution. As the 1990s move toward their midpoint and the world prepares to enter a new millennium marked by technological speed, instant communications, and accelerated globalization, a project takes shape in Gillette's offices and laboratories that for years remained surrounded by extreme secrecy. Almost as if it were part of a space program. Engineers refer to it by code names. Executives discuss it in closed meetings, prototypes are kept under lock and key, and any leak of information is considered a top-level strategic risk. That atmosphere of secrecy feeds the intuition that the company is attempting something more ambitious than a simple incremental improvement. This is not about adding a lubricating strip or slightly redesigning the handle, but about striking the table with a decisive move that once again redefines what it means to shave at home. The project is born from an internal question that has been circulating for years. How far can cartridge engineering be pushed so that shaving becomes significantly better? Not a little better, not marginally smoother, but so clearly superior that the consumer feels that all previous shaves belong to another era. That question activates a massive research machine, with teams of specialists in material dynamics, experts in microfabrication, chemists analyzing the behavior of advanced coatings, industrial designers, and marketing professionals studying how to communicate such a technical improvement without losing the general public. In the laboratories, the first experiments start from a premise that no longer surprises today, but that at the time was almost bold. If two coordinated blades could offer a noticeably better shave than one, perhaps three blades, placed with millimetric precision and adapted to a head with independent suspension, could raise the standard to a level never seen before. But it was not just about adding one more blade. The real challenge was to make those three blades work as a dynamic set, with each one having a complementary function, and to ensure that the cartridge could glide over the skin with a smoothness impossible in previous systems. Development advances step by step. The microscopic behavior of hair when it comes into contact with several blades in sequence is studied. The way skin responds to the glide of an improved lubricating strip is analyzed, and dozens of materials for the head structures are evaluated. Each prototype is tested with hundreds of volunteers. Irritation, redness, sensations of tightness and closeness in difficult areas, such as the jaw or the chin, are measured. The goal is not simply that the shave looks good, but that it feels good, that the entire experience conveys fluidity, lightness, and control. Gillette wants the user to notice a real difference from the very first use. When the final product design is ready, the company enters a launch preparation phase that is, in itself, a monumental deployment. The chosen name, Mach 3, is not accidental. It refers to supersonic speeds that cross the sound barrier, a symbolic nod to the idea of speed, power, and extreme precision. The name turns the razor into something more than a hygiene item. It places it in the sphere of advanced engineering, the closest thing to a small piece of high technology that a man will hold in his hands when he wakes up each morning. The launch in 1998 becomes a carefully orchestrated global event. Gillette coordinates its release in dozens of countries, invests record-breaking sums in advertising campaigns, sponsors massive events, occupies strategic spaces in supermarkets and pharmacies, and trains sales teams to explain the technical features of the new product in an understandable way. It is an operation that combines emotional marketing with scientific foundations, showing animated graphics of how the three blades work together, while at the same time appealing to the idea that the modern man deserves a tool worthy of the time in which he lives. The initial acceptance of Mach 3 exceeds expectations. Consumers perceive a clear leap compared to previous systems. Less irritation, less need to repeat strokes, and a greater sense of control in curved areas of the face. The head, with its individual suspension for each blade, adapts better to contours, while the lubricating strip improves the smoothness of the glide. Many users who had never paid attention to technical shaving details begin to talk about the change as if it were a small personal discovery. The experience generates almost immediate loyalty. Those who try Mach 3 in many cases do not want to go back. From a business perspective, the impact is enormous. The price of the Mach 3 cartridge is higher than that of previous systems, but consumers accept the increase without much resistance because they perceive that they are paying for real technology, not for a cosmetic change. Margins for the company expand. The blades become a premium product within a category that was already profitable. And Gillette once again consolidates the model it knows so well. A durable handle and a high-value replacement. This time, however, the technological barrier is higher than ever. Protected by a mountain of patents that make it extremely difficult for competitors to replicate the system without infringing rights. Schick and other competitors react, study Mach 3, and try to approach it with 3-blade products or alternative innovations. But Gillette has moved ahead on a key point: time. The company has invested so much in research that its advances are secured for several years, and its presence in the market becomes so dominant that the cultural narrative tilts in its favor. In more than one country, the phrase "I shave with Mach 3" becomes synonymous with using the best, with being up to date, with having a certain level of personal standards. The brand achieves what very few have managed, turning an everyday object into a symbol of quiet status. In addition, the launch of Mach 3 takes place at a time when the media landscape is undergoing a radical transformation. With the rise of the internet, the multiplication of television channels, and the expansion of early digital marketing, Gillette adapts quickly to this new environment, combining the strength of traditional television with more segmented strategies in magazines, sponsorships, and advertisements aimed at different male profiles. Even the packaging and in-store presentation become a crucial part of the visual impact. Metallic colors, futuristic design, an aesthetic closer to the aerospace industry than to the world of hygiene. Mach 3 achieves something rare in consumer markets, remaining relevant for years without losing its shine. Even when improved versions appear, such as Mach 3 Turbo, the original product continues to occupy a privileged space on shelves, becomes a contemporary classic, and establishes a standard that forces the company to think about how to surpass it in the future. That internal challenge will be the seed of the next deep innovation. But it also makes it clear that Gillette has found a strange balance between tradition and vanguard, between the pure physics of steel and the emotional narrative of the man who prepares each morning to face the day. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the arrival of Mach 3 demonstrates that even in an apparently mature industry, where the product has been evolving for more than a century, it is still possible to surprise the market if technological vision, patience in development, and communication capable of turning microscopic details into selling points are combined. It is a lesson that many companies in different sectors would look at with envy. The ability to reinvent something as everyday as shaving and turn it into an event. With Mach 3, Gillette secures its dominance heading into the new millennium and prepares the ground for alliances, corporate moves, and even deeper transformations in its global structure. Transformations that will forever change the scale, reach, and influence of the company. In that new scenario, shaving will no longer be simply a product, but one more piece within a gigantic ecosystem of personal consumption that is expanding at a speed the company is fully prepared to take advantage of. The acquisition by Procter & Gamble. When Mach 3 establishes itself as one of the most successful launches in the history of shaving, and Gillette celebrates figures that exceed what any executive had imagined just a few years earlier, the company finds itself at a delicate strategic point. Because success, when it is so overwhelming, can become a double-edged sword. On one hand, it secures a dominant position. On the other, it awakens the interest of gigantic players that operate at even higher levels of the consumer market. And among those giants, there is one that watches Gillette's trajectory with particular attention: Procter & Gamble. The corporation that for decades has controlled brands that reach billions of households around the world, and that is always looking for opportunities to reinforce its dominance in the personal care sector. At the beginning of the 2000s, Gillette's leadership analyzes a business world that has become more competitive than ever. Mergers and acquisitions are the rule of the game. Companies seek global synergies, logistical costs acquire central importance, and marketing has become a field where those who can invest more and do so with greater precision are the ones who win. Gillette, as profitable as it may be, is not immune to this trend. The company has a clear focus centered on shaving, deodorants, and some lines of batteries and small household products, but it lacks the gigantic ecosystem that other corporations possess. Its strength is deep, but not broad. Procter & Gamble, for its part, dominates entire categories: shampoos, detergents, diapers, creams, soaps, feminine hygiene products, brands that anyone recognizes as soon as they are mentioned. For years, it has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to integrate companies, optimize its global structure, distribute products with almost military efficiency, and turn its marketing departments into a precision machine that studies cultural trends, consumption habits, and psychological behaviors with an impressive level of detail. From its perspective, Gillette represents a perfect strategic piece. A strong, recognized company with very high margins, present in millions of bathrooms, and above all, with a business model based on recurrence, something that fits perfectly with the philosophy of Procter & Gamble. The initial conversations between both companies take place under strict confidentiality, and for good reason. An acquisition of that magnitude not only involves moving gigantic amounts of capital, but also harmonizing very different corporate cultures. Gillette, with its historical pride, its identity marked by concrete inventions, and its aura of engineering applied to the male face, must find common ground with a corporation that functions like a multinational clockwork, where processes are studied down to the smallest detail, and decision-making is distributed in a highly structured way. What is fascinating is that both sides understand that the opportunity is too good to allow those differences to become an obstacle. In 2005, after intense negotiations and exhaustive financial analysis, Procter & Gamble officially announces the acquisition of Gillette in a deal valued at tens of billions of dollars. It is one of the largest mergers in the history of the consumer goods sector and generates an immediate impact in the press, in the markets, and in the public perception of both companies. For many, this move symbolizes a definitive consolidation of the industry, in which major brands no longer limit themselves to competing individually, but instead group under gigantic umbrellas capable of controlling entire chains of production, distribution, and global communication. From the inside, the integration presents enormous challenges. Gillette brings iconic products, patented technologies, specialized plants, and a very strong identity in the male market. Procter & Gamble brings structure, logistics, global suppliers, analytical tools, multidimensional marketing strategies, and a distribution network that reaches practically every country on the planet. The objective is clear: to turn Gillette into a perfectly integrated piece within a system that can multiply its reach. This implies reviewing processes, merging departments, unifying information systems, harmonizing sales channels, and, above all, building an internal narrative that allows employees from both corporate cultures to work in sync. One of the greatest immediate benefits is Procter & Gamble's ability to amplify Gillette's presence in markets where the brand was strong but still had room to grow. Supermarket chains and convenience stores that already maintained global agreements with Procter & Gamble become platforms where Gillette can expand more easily. Logistics are optimized, delivery times improve, distribution costs decrease. From a financial point of view, the operation makes perfect sense. A high-margin product such as razor refills, multiplied by the global machinery of Procter & Gamble, generates a synergy of enormous value. But the integration is not only a matter of operational efficiency. It also has a strong symbolic component. For Procter & Gamble, acquiring Gillette means adding to its portfolio a brand that has spent more than a century defining a fundamental part of male personal care. The company understands that, to maintain that legacy, it is not enough to absorb the brand. It is necessary to preserve its essence, to respect that aura of engineering and precision that has accompanied Gillette since its origins. For that reason, within the structure of Procter & Gamble, the brand receives space that allows it to continue innovating freely and to maintain a robust research department, something essential to sustaining its reputation in the market. In those first years after the acquisition, several launches take place that show how the two corporate cultures can work together with enormous effectiveness. Shaving systems evolved toward more complex technologies, such as fusion, introduced shortly thereafter. With 5 blades and a design intended to further consolidate Gillette's position in the premium segment. Marketing campaigns become more global, more coordinated, more adapted to contemporary trends around masculinity, lifestyle, and well-being. The brand begins to take part in broader cultural conversations, supported by the communicative power of Procter & Gamble. In addition, the company expands its vision toward complementary categories with a coherence it had not always had. Under the umbrella of Procter & Gamble, Gillette develops male grooming lines that include shaving gels, foams, deodorants, and skincare products, reinforcing the idea that shaving is not an isolated act, but part of a broader ritual linked to personal presentation. This strategy fits perfectly with the philosophy of Procter & Gamble, focused on building product ecosystems that reinforce one another, increasing user loyalty. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the acquisition represents a crucial lesson. Success is not always measured in independence. Sometimes it is measured in the ability to integrate into a larger structure without losing identity. Gillette had reached a natural ceiling as an independent company. The next level of expansion required resources and a network that only a corporation like Procter & Gamble could offer. The key was to do so without diluting what made it unique, and the integration, although complex, managed to maintain that delicate balance. With the passing of the years, the acquisition proves to be a success for both sides. Procter & Gamble incorporates into its portfolio one of the most powerful male brands on the planet, and Gillette gains access to a global infrastructure that enhances its ability to compete in a world where trends change quickly and innovation is mandatory. But this expansion, although beneficial, also opens the door to new challenges. From pressure by startups that seek to recover the charm of classic shaving, to cultural movements that question traditional advertising aimed at men. It is in that evolving territory where the brand will have to demonstrate whether it can still anticipate market changes with the same vision that characterized its history for more than a century. The present and the future of shaving. When the 21st century begins with its full avalanche of screens, electronic commerce, and hyper-connected consumption, Gillette arrives at this new stage carrying more than 100 years of history on its shoulders. Installed in millions of bathrooms, supported by the muscle of Procter & Gamble, and with a flagship product, Mach 3 first and Fusion later, that still breathes an air of absolute dominance. Although beneath the surface forces begin to move, that at first seem like small, isolated currents and end up turning into tides capable of calling into question everything the company took for granted about the behavior of the male consumer. The first major sign that the board has changed comes from a place that, at first glance, seems to have very few resources compared to a giant like Gillette. Small digital startups that dare to question the price structure, the distribution model, and the brand narrative that had gone decades without serious rivals. Companies like Dollar Shave Club or Harry's burst onto the scene with viral videos loaded with humor, promise really good blades at much lower prices, and rely on a direct-to-consumer subscription model that eliminates traditional intermediaries. Suddenly, the man who used to buy his blades almost without thinking during his weekly supermarket shopping is faced with the possibility of receiving blades at home, effortlessly, with communication that openly mocks the grandiose advertisements of the big brands. For Gillette, the blow is twofold. On the one hand, the price of its replacement blades is put under the spotlight, an issue with which many consumers had already carried a certain discomfort. On the other hand, the very solemnity of the category is questioned. That epic tone of extreme precision and almost space-age technology that had accompanied launches like Mach 3 and Fusion. The startups use the weapon of irreverence, of speaking plainly, and connect with a generation annoyed by what it perceives as an industry that has made an everyday gesture increasingly expensive. The message is simple. Blades do not have to cost so much. That kind of phrase, when repeated often enough, begins to sink in. Gillette's response does not take long. The company adjusts prices, launches more affordable lines, experiments with its own subscription models, and begins to listen more carefully to a murmur it had ignored for too long, the feeling that consumers are no longer willing to accept the rules of the game without discussion. From an entrepreneurship perspective, this is a key moment because it forces the giant to react with humility, to recognize that new voices with fresh proposals have emerged, and to accept that the loyalty built over decades is not indestructible. The name carries weight, but it is not enough. Added to the competitive pressure is another phenomenon that radically changes the landscape of the male face. The massive return of the beard in all its versions. From the dense urban lumberjack-style beard to meticulously groomed beards that fill fashion magazines, television series, and social networks. For many years, advertising insisted on the completely clean, shaven face as a practically unquestionable ideal. Suddenly, wearing a beard stops being synonymous with neglect and becomes a legitimate, even aspirational, aesthetic option. For a company that lives off blades that cut hair close to the skin, this cultural shift forces a rethinking of its role. Far from surrendering, Gillette decides to redefine its relationship with facial hair. Instead of limiting itself to preaching total shaving, it begins to position itself as an ally of beard management. Trimmers, specific razors for shaping edges, complementary skin products, messages that speak about finding one's own style instead of imposing a single face model. This move toward grooming, toward male care understood as a set of rituals that include beard, hair, skin, and fragrance, expands the playing field. The brand no longer limits itself to offering blades. It tries to offer an ecosystem. While all this happens on the cultural level, technical evolution continues in the laboratories. Systems like Fusion appear, with 5 blades and a precision strip on the back for difficult areas. Improved versions like Pro Glide and Pro Shield, with advanced coatings to reduce friction. And products like Gillette Skin Guard, designed for men with sensitive skin who suffer with more aggressive razors. They even dare with concepts that a few years earlier would have seemed extravagant, such as the heated razor, a razor that incorporates a thermal bar to simulate the feeling of a hot barber towel with every stroke. Or the Gillette Labs projects, where the blade is integrated into minimalist design handles with elements like built-in exfoliating bands. But technological innovation can no longer ignore a concern that is growing in the collective consciousness. Sustainability. Every plastic cartridge, every disposable razor, every wrapper enters the radar of consumers and regulators who demand less waste, more recycling, and more responsible materials. Gillette has to face the paradox of a business model that has historically depended on selling frequent replacements and, at the same time, demonstrate that it understands the environmental implications of filling the world with single-use plastic and metal. Recycling programs emerge in collaboration with third parties, reduced packaging is tested, and alternative materials are researched, while public conversation begins to value performance and ecological impact equally. In the field of communication, the brand is also pushed to evolve. The old script of the successful, self-confident man, perfectly shaved and untouched by doubt, begins to ring hollow in a world where the concept of masculinity is openly questioned. A recent campaign, in which Gillette addresses male behavior and distances itself from toxic attitudes, sparks an enormous global discussion. Praise from those who celebrate the brand's attempt to align its values with a more responsible discourse, and criticism from those who feel it has become moralizing or condescending. Beyond opinions, the episode highlights something important. Gillette can no longer speak to men as it did in the 1950s or 1970s, because the man it addresses today lives in an environment where identity, gender, and social expectations are far more complex. At the same time, personalization becomes a key word. Consumers want to feel that the product adapts to their skin, their beard, their lifestyle, and even their aesthetic taste. Gillette experiments with customizable handles, special editions, engravings, color combinations, and digital platforms that allow blade delivery frequency to be adjusted to the user's real habits. The idea of one generic razor for everyone begins to give way to more specific configurations, supported by data and by the audience segmentation capabilities offered by the digital environment. Looking ahead, the future of shaving and of Gillette appears as a combination of several forces pulling in different directions and forcing the company to maintain a delicate balance. On one hand, pressure toward sustainability will continue to grow, so it is reasonable to imagine more reusable materials, long-lasting handles, and recycling systems integrated into the purchasing experience. On the other hand, personalization may deepen to levels where the razor adapts not only to beard density, but to growth patterns, skin sensitivity, and usage habits measured through data, perhaps even with connected devices that record the experience and adjust it over time. At the same time, multiple face styles are likely to coexist. Full beards, trimmed beards, completely shaved faces, hybrids that change depending on the season or stage of life. Gillette will have to continue adapting its catalog so that the same man can turn to the brand whether he decides to shave every day or prefers to shape a 3-week beard. The key will be understanding the customer journey over the years, not just the gesture of a single morning. What is fascinating about observing the present and projecting the future of Gillette is seeing to what extent the company no longer sells only blades. It sells a way of relating to one's own face, to identity, and to the image each person wants to present to the world. The young man who receives his first razor, the man who decides to grow a beard and later shave again, the person who worries about the ecological footprint of each purchase. All are part of a story that began more than a century ago with a tired salesman looking at a razor in front of the mirror. At its core, the question that will accompany Gillette in the coming years will always be the same, even if phrased with new words. How to remain relevant in the intimacy of the bathroom. When market rules, social expectations, and environmental awareness change so quickly. The answer, if we look at everything that has happened since that first safety razor to today's systems, seems to point toward a combination of memory and audacity, of respect for the original invention and the courage to provoke breaks when necessary. And it is there, on that thin line between tradition and constant reinvention, where it is decided whether a brand of more than 100 years remains alive or becomes a simple memory on the shelf of business history. And here we arrive tonight, after traveling through more than 100 years of history, innovation, and entrepreneurship. If you enjoyed this journey and want us to keep exploring stories of legendary brands together, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. I also invite you to subscribe so you do not miss the next documentaries on the channel. Thank you for accompanying me once again. Good night.